everyone. Welcome. I have a wonderful guest that I'm excited to introduce you all to today. Welcome, Harmeet. Thank you so much for being with us.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, you have such an interesting and rich background and experience. I'm just going to quickly run through some of the highlights of who you are as a person to introduce you to people, and then we'll jump into what I believe is going to be a very interesting conversation. So Harmeet was born originally in India and moved to the United States as a child. And I'm really in awe that you graduated from high school at age 16 and attended Dartmouth and then law school at the University of Virginia. And you have done constitutional litigation. You've worked for the Department of Justice. She's clerked with federal appeals courts and had a very rich career in the legal industry. And so you are an expert on many topics, but today what I'd love to pick your brain on is religious liberties and the time of coronavirus. And I know you're an expert on that, and I look forward to talking with you about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an issue that's very dear to my heart as a person of faith, and we've been fighting these battles for many years in the courts.
Yeah. So what you talk about the battles that you've been fighting for so long. What is coming up like newly because of the coronavirus? What new aspects of the fight are you seeing where the government might be infringing on our religious liberties because of the coronavirus crisis?
Well, as governors around the country have imposed various levels of shutdown, religion has fallen by the wayside. So the approach that many governors have taken, including California, where I live, is for the governor to say basically everything is off limits and then carving out a few exceptions. So the governor at the beginning of this process said that everybody was to stay at home. This is about 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago almost now. And then he said certain people are essential workers, and essential workers included the media, people who work at grocery stores, people who work at a few other businesses, laundromats, etc. For religion, the governor said that essential workers included religious clergy or helpers who went to a church or other religious facility to put on a socially distanced service in the form of technology assisted, so video or telephone. But in-person communal worship, even through social distancing of the same type that we're allowed to use in the Walmart or the grocery store, laundromat, or the marijuana store, alcohol store in California, is not permitted. And so to me, that is unconstitutional because, in fact, those of us who worship regularly do like to worship communally, and it can be done safely. So for the government to impose different restrictions on religion than on other functions of life is discriminatory and unconstitutional. Excuse me.
Yeah. And this falls under the First Amendment and religious freedom, but also it infringes on our right to assemble. How do you distinguish between those two rights and what you're doing to fight the government overreach?
It's an excellent question. So the federal courts have evolved different standards for the 5 different rights under the First Amendment. We have the right to free speech, which everybody's familiar with, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. And these are all at sort of the highest level of protection. And there's also a right to petition and freedom of religion. Now, unfortunately, in a Supreme Court case that Justice Scalia authored involving peyote, which anybody who went to law school is familiar with, the famous Smith case, which is a peyote case, the court said that if there is a law of facially neutral law of general applicability, then the court will not give any special consideration to the fact that that law may burden religion. So in that case, the court found that even though a law that prevented somebody who, through their Native American religious worship, ingested peyote from certain types of employment with the state in that case, that was okay because it wasn't discriminated against religion. It was sort of an incidental thing. Our argument here in these cases in California, and the same argument that lawyers have made in Kentucky and Kansas and other states, is that where you have a broad shutdown, but then you have numerous exceptions with literally over 1 million workers in California being able to go to their jobs socially distanced, and all 40 million Californians being able to go to the grocery store and do other functions socially distanced. It is discriminatory to relegate religion to a second-class status. So we made that argument. And in fact, our 3 clients who are church pastors and 1 client who's a parishioner wanted to do services that were at a minimum like drive-in type services in the parking lot of a church, but also communal services inside the church, socially distanced, wearing masks and sitting 6 feet apart with family units sitting apart. And after we filed our lawsuit and sought a temporary restraining order, the state of California came back and the governor wrote in his brief that, in fact, it was okay to have drive-in services. So effectively, the government amended its order, but the government argued that it was unsafe for people to be able to come together to worship. Now, the court unfortunately agreed with the government in that situation. We will be appealing that to the Ninth Circuit. Meanwhile, anybody who turns on the news can see that there are literally hundreds of thousands, some would even say millions of Californians out there on the streets doing what they're doing. And there is increasingly less justification for these orders. And the governor has told us in various briefings, he's really a one-man show. And even, I would say, liberal organizations have pointed out, news organizations have said, this is not a one-party rule in California, it's a one-person rule right now. So he's been making noises that we're going to be shut down through the fall, shut down in some degrees until there's a vaccine for this disease, which of course he seems to be assuming that every Californian is going to be willing to take this vaccine, which I think is a long shot. And secondly, that we're going to be willing to wait for 18 months. And in the meanwhile, have no worship communally, no baptisms, no other types of services that really require people to come together. Weddings will be limited to 10 people or less. Funerals are limited. We cannot go on with our lives like this. These are worse restrictions that Americans have suffered under in wartime. And this is totally unacceptable. So although I did not win that initial hearing, we will continue to fight this aggressively because this is a very fundamental right. And as I explained to the court, if you limit people's ability to come together and worship safely and reasonably, they're going to drive religion underground. It is underground in China, Iran, and other repressive regimes. It's going to become a repressive regime here in California where people are huddling in their living rooms and worshiping, perhaps not as safely as they could in a large church. So this can be exacerbating a health crisis, but unfortunately the governor is getting his way. But I will say that the legislature seems to be chafing at the bit a little bit. I've also filed 2 other lawsuits against the governor for different issues since that hearing. And we do expect that at some point the courts will begin to see it our way.
Yeah. Well, here in Illinois, we haven't had any specific religious liberty challenges to the governor. But just today, we had a judge rule that the governor extending his emergency stay-at-home orders was not allowed, and he needs to start opening the state regionally, which is a big issue for my part of the state because we're more rural and coronavirus has not been as exacerbated here in our part of the state as it has been in the urban area of Chicago.
Right.
So there's legal challenges left and right on these issues.
Absolutely. So in the case you're just describing, it was a Republican state legislator from a rural part of the state. I believe his town has less than 400 people. And he correctly pointed out that there should be different rules for different parts of the state and one size does not fit all. I would go even further, and many people would go further and say the entire concept that you can quarantine people who are not sick is unconstitutional, and it's actually beyond the scope of our California health law as well. And so I'm taking a look at that issue. Here in California today, 6 county leaders petitioned the governor to be allowed to open up. These are rural counties. People are spread out. And I think there need to be different rules for cities like New York, even cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, which, by the way, also, relatively speaking, have very few cases compared to, places that are rural. Here where I'm sitting in Sonoma County, I'm sitting on an acre of land. Nobody's sitting on top of each other. And we have, really very, very lightly populated per capita and very few cases. I don't know anybody who's sick with coronavirus, frankly, in California personally.
And I do want to ask you a few more questions, but while I take an interlude, I do want to encourage if anyone has questions that they want to write in the comments, we will ask listener questions. So go ahead and comment a question if you have one. But Harmeet, you mentioned that you just filed another case today. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So we are in touch with citizens throughout California who are very frustrated. So I filed a couple of lawsuits, and last week on Friday, in conjunction with the Garagos law firm, we filed a lawsuit on behalf of small businesses in Southern California that feel like it is very arbitrary that certain businesses are allowed to operate and certain businesses are not. So we filed that lawsuit. Now today, we filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in Sacramento against the governor and the attorney general and the California Highway Patrol. The California Highway Patrol was ordered by the governor last week to not issue any protest permits. There was a protest there, and one of our clients actually participated in that protest. And then the governor didn't like it, so he ordered the California Highway Patrol to stop it. Under the governor's orders, no protests are allowed. So there is a blanket ban on protected First Amendment activity. And it's not just the right to speech, but the right to assemble and the right to petition your government. So our two clients, in one case, was a registered firearms dealer and trainer who has been selling guns to people during this crisis because people are very concerned about the ability of firearms and they want to defend themselves against looters, which are actually increasing in California. But the state is refusing to process the background checks that are required for those individuals to pick up their guns illegally. And they're also refusing to process background checks for employees of the gun shop. So he wants to protest that. He went to get a permit. He expects that 1,000 people will show up. And he asked for the entire Capitol lawn area around the Capitol because in order to have social distancing, that would be a responsible way to do it. And the California Highway Patrol politely, responded saying, unfortunately, the governor says you can't have a permit. Our other client is a engaged California resident who is also running for office, but she wants to protest the extension of the governor's orders and their wide sweep and their lack of consideration for business owners and the fact that people are literally going hungry and losing sleep and not able to, function under today's shutdown orders. And same thing. The California Highway Patrol denied her permit over the phone. So the governor is allowed, and even in an emergency, there can be some rules, but there must be reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on speech. And here, there are no reasonable restrictions. There is just a total ban, and that's unconstitutional. So we're seeking a temporary restraining order against the governor and seeking that a federal court order them to allow some form of protest, socially distanced. If people are allowed to go with unlimited numbers and unlimited duration to the Walmart or Costco or grocery store, they ought to be allowed as adult citizens in California to protest legally and responsibly at the California Capitol.
That is such a fundamental right, just to have that capacity. So I appreciate that you're defending that right for the citizens of California, and vicariously, I'm sure it will flow over to help the citizens of Illinois.
I hope so. Well, I'm in touch, by the way, with people in your state who are seeking liberty themselves, and we may be filing a lawsuit there as well.
Okay, that's good to know. Well, I do have a few questions. Craig asked, does Davidson versus Smith make a free exercise challenge in our current situation particularly difficult? Is that a question?
I don't have Davidson versus Smith in front of me, but if the case is the Smith case involving the peyote case, I think I've discussed that.
Yeah.
The religion issue is on a slightly lower pedestal than the other aspects of the First Amendment right now. But even in those cases, if the law is not a law of general applicability, then the normal levels of scrutiny apply. And so here the argument is that in fact we have a law with so many exceptions that it is not a general law and neutrally applicable, and accordingly the strict scrutiny should apply.
Great. And one other question, I'm not familiar with this situation, so I'll tread lightly. The General Flynn situation, are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with it, yes, and his lawyer is a friend of mine.
Okay, so someone asked if you could just expound on what you think of that situation.
Well, I understand there'll be some bombshell news coming out this week regarding it, but basically the issue is that the general there are a number of issues. First issue is that the general was asked to answer, quote unquote, a few questions by one of these rogue FBI guys who's now been fired. And right after the swearing in, or literally, I think the same day of the inauguration or the swearing in. And so he answered them, and it turns out to have been a trap laid for him by FBI agents who then did not write down exactly what he said. at the time or take a tape recording or anything, but then they sort of made up different versions of it. So the scandal now is that the FBI may have altered what was said in that interview. Also, a scandal, and maybe a bigger scandal for me as an attorney, is that apparently the initial lawyers for General Flynn were almost acting sort of more as agents for the government than anything else. And apparently the general was threatened that if he did not plead guilty to these fake allegations, that the FBI and the DOJ would charge his son, the Mueller team would charge his son with criminal offenses. And, you know, many people who have families would, of course, do anything to keep their children from suffering harm. And so he was really coerced. And under those circumstances, it's an absolutely appalling travesty of justice that should never happen to any American, regardless of your political background. It's disgusting that the FBI engaged in this conduct. And so I understand that the Attorney General has personally looked at this and in order to review the conduct of the law enforcement officers here. And that could very well invalidate a plea and lead to the dismissal of the charges. And I very much hope that happens this week.
Well, great. Thank you for sharing some of your knowledge on that. We are almost at the end of our time together, but I do want to highlight that you are a board member for the Trump 2020 advisory. You're a Trump 2020 advisory board member. Can you? We have a lot of fans of President Trump here in the Illinois 17th Congressional District. Can you share about what it's like to sit on that advisory board?
Sure. Well, the advisory board is a number of media surrogates who are trained at dealing with the media on behalf of the campaign. And so I've been in that capacity for more than a year now. And I'm also one of their surrogates for legal issues. So I go on television to talk about, you know, frequently on the impeachment matters, and there may be other issues like that. But on top of that, I'm also co-chair nationally of Women for Trump. And in that leadership position, I help engage women to support the president. And, you know, it's an honor to be on this group, a lot of engaged patriots. Just to be clear, I'm a volunteer on the campaign. I'm also a member of the Republican National Committee. That's also a volunteer position. I do not get paid for my positions in politics, and I do it out of my love for my country. As an immigrant, I really value and cherish everything that the president has fought for, and fought for our businesses, fought for our economy, fought for our freedom, fought for the right to life, and fought for people of faith. And so it is a very easy choice for me to support this president and talk about why I can do that and why I should do that, and how our country would be a very different place today. And frankly, even with this coronavirus being a completely different, terrible place, I think, without his amazing leadership.
Yes, I certainly agree with that and think the president is doing a great job. Well, Harmeet, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time. You are a busy woman with all the political activities as well as legal missions that you're on. And I know everyone that is in the Illinois 17th really appreciates that you took the time to talk with us and share what our rights are so that we can learn from you and really make decisions as we go forward during this coronavirus crisis.
Thank you. And thank you for running. I know what a big sacrifice that is, having run for office myself, and I wish you all the best with your campaign.
Well, thank you. Similar to you, it's an honor to do it for my country.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you, everyone who's watching. It's a pleasure to get to be with you, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, everybody.